It was Tuesday, 7:12 in the morning. I was standing in my kitchen, buttering a piece of sourdough toast while half awake. The radio was mumbling in the background about traffic jams on the interstate, a sound so normal it felt like a safety blanket. Then, the doorbell rang twice in a row. It was not a polite, mid-morning visitor chime. It was urgent. When I opened the door, our building's night security guard, a man named Frank, who usually just gave a friendly nod, stood there with his hat in his hand. His eyes were careful, darting back and forth as if he were delivering news of a fire. He didn't step inside. Instead, he cleared his throat and asked a question that made the world stop spinning. He asked if my husband had started doing overnight guest registrations for our unit now. I felt a strange, airy laugh bubble up in my throat because the question seemed so absurd. My husband, a man of rigid routines and early bedtimes, would never do such a thing. But Frank didn't laugh back. His face remained stony and professional, etched with a pity that chilled me faster than the morning air. My name is Felicia Belair, and I am 34 years old. Up until that Tuesday, I believed I was living a life of quiet stability. Frank showed me his digital clipboard, the screen glowing with cold, hard data. He pointed to a recurring name. The same woman had signed into our building 3 times last week. Every single entry was time-stamped after midnight. The destination was always the same. My unit number, my home. Frank apologized profusely, his voice dropping to a whisper as he explained that he had simply assumed I knew about these late-night visits. I thanked him with a voice that sounded remarkably calm, even though my fingers had gone completely numb against the doorframe. I stepped back inside and closed the door softly before my husband, Julian, could come downstairs for his breakfast. When he finally appeared, smoothing his silk tie and smelling of expensive sandalwood, he paused and asked why I looked so pale. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the toaster. I simply looked at the burnt edges of my breakfast and lied. I told him the bread was stale. It was the first of many lies I would tell to protect my new, dark secret. As soon as Julian left for his high-stakes office job, I began my own work. I sat at my desk and pulled up the digital logs of our shared life. I checked his recent, late work nights against the security logbook entries Frank had shown me. It was a perfect, sickening match. Every night he claimed to be stuck in a strategy meeting. The visitor had signed in within 15 minutes of his arrival. The dates lined up, the hours were identical. I even found the fake calendar blocks on our shared digital schedule, neatly labeled as vendor calls. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a chaotic mistake. This was a masterclass in scheduling. For years, forgiveness had been my favorite hobby. I forgave the forgotten anniversaries, the sharp tones, and the long absences. I thought it was what made me a good wife. But staring at those timestamps, my capacity for mercy vanished instantly. Suddenly, my marriage didn't feel like a sacred bond anymore. It felt like a bad subscription service that I had been paying for with my soul, and I was finally ready to hit the cancel button. I decided right then that I would not confront him. Not yet. A confrontation is a gift. It gives the liar a chance to pivot, to gaslight, or to beg for a forgiveness I no longer possessed. Instead, I chose the path of the quiet switch. I spent the afternoon upgrading our home router to a professional-grade system and enabling detailed device logging. I turned on automatic cloud backups for our shared tablet, ensuring every photo and message would be mirrored to a private drive he couldn't see. To set the stage for my ultimate investigation, I told Julian I was scheduling a fake weekend trip to visit my elderly aunt in the countryside. He looked relieved, almost too eager to help me pack. He kissed my forehead and told me I deserved the rest. I told him I had already booked the train ticket. On Friday evening, I walked out the door with a suitcase, making sure he saw me leave. But I never went to the station. I canceled the trip and stayed in the city. Saturday night arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat. At 10:43 p.m., I sat in my car, which was parked across the street in the shadows of a large oak tree. I pulled up the baby monitor app on my phone, a system we had installed years ago for our son and had never bothered to delete. Through the grainy camera feed, I watched my own living room. The lights dimmed. Soft jazz music began to filter through the speakers. Then, I saw Julian doing something he never did for me. He began lighting vanilla-scented candles, placing them carefully on the coffee table. He went to the bedroom and emerged wearing a crisp, new linen shirt I had never seen before. He sprayed a different cologne, a musky scent that wasn't his usual brand. He was in full performance mode, a man preparing for a premiere. At exactly 11:02 p.m., the doorbell rang. When he opened it, the woman walked in. She wasn't a stranger, she was the coordinator for my son's after-school program. My stomach dropped through the floor and kept going. The betrayal wasn't just marital, it was institutional. This was someone I trusted with my child. Sunday morning, I returned home early and stood in the kitchen to make pancakes. Julian walked into the room, smiling, looking refreshed and victorious. He kissed my cheek, the scent of that unfamiliar cologne still faintly clinging to his skin, and told me he had worked late on a new project while I was away. I didn't flinch. I slid a warm plate of pancakes toward him and looked him dead in the eye. I told him I was glad his late meetings smelled like vanilla candles now. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. I watched the blood drain from his face for exactly one heartbeat. It was a flicker of pure, unadulterated terror. Then, he forced a laugh, resumed chewing, and tried to act as if nothing had happened. He thought he could outrun me. He didn't realize I was already miles ahead, marking the path of his destruction. The following week, I became a librarian of betrayal. I built a digital vault that would have made a prosecutor proud. I organized folders by date, filled with screenshots of the visitor logs, router pings that showed her phone connecting to our Wi-Fi, and audio clips from the monitor. I mapped out the calendar overlaps where his business trips perfectly aligned with her vacation days. I labeled every file with clinical precision. Once my vault was full, I booked 2 secret consultations, one with a family attorney and another with a financial advisor. I sat in their glass-walled offices and showed them e-work. Both of them looked at the sheer volume of evidence and said the exact same word: document. They told me that in a world of he said, she said, data is the only thing that doesn't blink. I wasn't just a woman scorned. I was a woman building a case. I left those meetings feeling a strange sense of power. I wasn't waiting for him to tell the truth anymore. I was the one who owned the truth now. I began to apply soft pressure, a series of surgical strikes designed to create friction in his comfortable world. I started by removing his administrative access to our joint utility portal, claiming there had been a security breach and I was resetting everything. I changed the passwords to all our streaming services and the home security system. Most importantly, I shifted our automatic transfers into a monitored account that required my secondary authorization for any withdrawal. None of this was loud or explosive. It was just a series of small, frustrating hurdles. Julian began to complain about the technical glitches. He'd huff and puff at the dinner table because he couldn't log into the movie channel or check the electric bill. I would just offer a thin, practiced smile and tell him that technology was simply acting strange lately. I watched him squirm, seeing the tiny cracks of anxiety begin to form in his carefully maintained facade. He knew something was shifting, but he couldn't find the source of the wind. One evening, I decided to let him see the monster under the bed. I left my laptop open on the dining room table while I went into the kitchen to make tea. I didn't leave a note or a dramatic letter. I simply left the screen on a split-view display. On the left side was the security log from the night Frank visited me. On the right side were the visitor timestamps from the previous Saturday. It was a silent, undeniable map of his lies. I stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, listening to the silence of the house. I knew he was standing there, reading it. I waited for the explosion, the excuses, or the typical, "how dare you spy on me" defense. But it never came. After a long, agonizing silence, I heard the soft click of the laptop lid closing. Then I heard him pick up the kitchen trash bag and take it outside without being asked. I realized then that fear is a much quieter emotion than guilt. The time for domestic games was over. It was time for institutional moves. I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted a record. I drafted a formal letter to the director of my son's after-school program. I reported a serious policy violation regarding staff fraternization with enrolled parents. I didn't use emotional language or call names. I used the language of compliance. I attached the building logs and the timestamps showing her frequent midnight visits to a parent's home. I sent the email at 9 a.m. on a Thursday. By 9:30 a.m., I received a notification that the email had been read. Within 24 hours, the director responded, stating that they had opened a formal internal investigation into the matter. They thanked me for my diligence in maintaining the safety and integrity of the program. While Julian was at work, thinking he was still managing his secret life, the walls of the coordinator's career were already beginning to crumble. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage. I was holding people accountable to the rules they had agreed to follow. I decided to host a small family dinner on Sunday, inviting his parents, his uncle, and my favorite cousin. It looked like a normal, celebratory gathering. We had roast chicken and fine wine. But midway through dessert, I picked up the remote and turned on the large TV in the living room. I played a muted clip of the entry camera footage, showing the coordinator arriving at our door at midnight. The timestamps were displayed in bright red numbers at the bottom of the screen. As the video looped, I walked around the table and passed around neatly printed copies of the building logs like they were party favors. I didn't give a speech. I didn't cry. I just sat back down and took a sip of my coffee. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the clinking of silverware and the rustle of the paper logs. Silence spread through the room like spilled ink on a white tablecloth. Julian stared at his plate, unable to look at his father or his uncle. The proof was undeniable. As the silence stretched, Julian's uncle, a man who had always been quiet and observant, cleared his throat. He looked at the logs and then looked at Julian with a heavy, disappointed expression. He dropped a bombshell I never saw coming. This is not the first time. My heart stopped. The uncle explained that there had been a similar complaint at Julian's previous job, which had been quietly settled. I had never been told. I was told he left for a better opportunity. My head spun as I realized my history of forgiveness had been based on a curated, edited version of reality. My forgiveness suddenly had a history section I hadn't known existed. I wasn't dealing with a one-time mistake. I was dealing with a serial predator of trust. This revelation was the final nail in the coffin. The man I thought I knew was a fiction, a character played by a performer who had been practicing this routine long before I even suspected a thing. On Monday morning at 9:03 a.m., while Julian was likely sitting in a morning briefing, my attorney filed the divorce papers. We didn't just ask for a split, we requested an immediate asset freeze and proposed a strict custody schedule. My attorney moved like a chess clock, precise and relentless. There was no room for negotiation or working things out. The paperwork was served to Julian at his office, in front of his colleagues. I wanted him to feel the same public exposure I felt when Frank stood at my door with that clipboard. By noon, I had changed the locks on the apartment and packed 3 suitcases of his belongings, which I left with the front desk. I felt a strange, cold clarity. The man who had used my kindness as a shield was finally standing out in the open, unprotected by the lies he had woven so carefully. The transition from wife to adversary was complete, and I felt more alive than I had in years. Julian came home that evening, but he couldn't get past the lobby. He called me, his voice cracking with tears. He begged me to let him up, saying the affair meant nothing, saying he was under immense stress at work, saying he was confused. He sounded like a script for a bad soap opera. I stood on our balcony, looking down at the city lights, and realized I felt nothing heroic or tragic. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. I just felt done. It was like reading a book that was so poorly written, I decided to close it mid-sentence. I told him through the phone that his confusion was no longer my problem to solve. I hung up and blocked his number. That night, I went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in months. The weight of trying to forgive the unforgivable had been lifted. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the author of my own next chapter, and the silence in the apartment felt like a beautiful, clean slate. The next day, the after-school program coordinator contacted me directly. She didn't call to apologize or beg for mercy. Instead, she sent a scathing email threatening a defamation claim, accusing me of ruining her reputation with false allegations. I didn't reply. I simply forwarded the email to my attorney. I could practically hear him smiling through the screen when he responded. He told me that threats are like fireworks, loud and bright, but they disappear instantly. Documentation, however, is like gravity. It pulls everything down eventually. We had the logs, the Wi-Fi pings, and the witness statement from Frank. Her threats were empty gasping for air. I realized that people like her and Julian rely on the fear and silence of others to survive. Once you stop being afraid and start being a record keeper, their power evaporates. I spent the afternoon at the park with my son, watching him play, feeling a fierce sense of protection. I was cleaning up the world for him, one lie at a time. The institutional wheels continued to turn. The child care organization officially suspended the coordinator pending a full board review. Their legal team and their insurance provider reached out to me, requesting copies of my detailed logs. My private files, the ones I had curated with such pain, became official exhibits in a corporate investigation. My inbox, which used to be filled with school newsletters and grocery lists, turned into a digital courtroom hallway. I provided everything: the timestamps, the photos of the candles, the router data. I watched as her career, which she had built on the trust of parents, began to unravel under the weight of her own choices. It wasn't revenge, it was a consequence. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that she wouldn't be able to do this to another family. I was learning that standing up for yourself isn't just about your own peace, it's about setting a standard for what is acceptable in your community. I was no longer the nice wife who looked the other way. My forensic financial advisor delivered the next blow. A deep dive into our joint accounts revealed a trail of breadcrumbs Julian thought he had covered. Long before he started bringing her to our apartment, he had been using our joint funds to book boutique hotels in the city. The timeline of his betrayal didn't just go back a few weeks, it doubled. He had been living this double life for months longer than I had initially suspected. Seeing the charges, the room service, the expensive wine, the anniversary dinners that weren't for me, felt like a physical punch, but it also provided the final piece of the puzzle. It proved that this wasn't a lapse in judgment, it was a lifestyle. He had been systematically draining our shared future to fund his private fantasies. Every dollar he spent on a hotel room was a dollar stolen from our son's college fund. The betrayal was now financial, emotional, and institutional. My resolve hardened into diamond. I wasn't just leaving a cheater. I was escaping a thief. As I dug deeper into the financial records, I found a specific charge linked to a business trip Julian said had been canceled at the last minute. He had stayed home that weekend, claiming he was devastated about the missed opportunity. But the credit card showed a luxury resort booking during those exact dates. This meant he never went where he said he went. It also meant that someone at his office might have known he was lying. I took a deep breath and called his office travel desk, pretending to be his executive assistant, checking on a missing receipt. The woman on the other end was helpful and efficient. She checked the records and confirmed my worst fear. No trip had ever been booked for those dates. In fact, Julian hadn't requested a travel booking in 6 months. He had been inventing corporate trips as a cover for his weekend getaways. The level of premeditation was staggering. He wasn't just lying to me, he was maintaining an entire secondary reality. The fallout at Julian's workplace began shortly after. HR reached out to me, requesting an informal meeting. When I arrived at their sleek corporate office, they were hesitant but professional. They revealed that there had been a recent internal complaint involving Julian and a vendor representative. It involved emotional boundary violations and inappropriate after-hours messaging. It was a different woman in a different location, but the pattern was identical. The same late-night vendor calls, the same secret meetings. I sat there and realized that this wasn't just an affair. It was a hobby. Julian didn't want a new life. He wanted the thrill of the hunt and the safety of a home to return to. He was a collector of secrets. I shared my logs with the HR team, showing them how he used company time and business trips to facilitate his behavior. They took notes in grim silence. The man who prided himself on his professional reputation was now being viewed as a liability. The dominoes began to fall in rapid succession. Julian's company opened a formal conduct review based on the evidence I provided and the internal complaints. His vendor contracts were paused, and he was placed on immediate administrative leave. He began texting me incessantly, his tone shifting from pleading to rage. He accused me of ruining his life, and destroying everything he had worked for. I looked at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. I only replied once. I wrote, "No, your habits did." I realized that he still didn't see himself as the cause of his own downfall. In his mind, he was the victim of my betrayal of his secrets. It was a classic narcissist's move, blaming the person who turned on the light instead of the person who committed the crime in the dark. I blocked him again, this time for good. I was done being the person he used to vent his frustrations. I was busy building a new life, and there was no room for his noise. A few days later, my neighbor from down the hall, Mrs. Higgins, stopped me in the mailroom. She looked nervous but determined. She confessed that she had tried to warn Julian off weeks ago after seeing the late-night visits. She had confronted him in the hallway, telling him it wasn't right. Julian had looked her in the eye and told her that I approved of open arrangements, and that we had a modern understanding. He had been using my very kindness and my reputation for being open-minded as a camouflage for his behavior. That revelation burned hotter than the cheating itself. He hadn't just betrayed our vows, he had weaponized my character against me. He had made me an unwitting accomplice in my own humiliation. I thanked Mrs. Higgins for her honesty and walked back to my apartment. The fire of that anger didn't consume me, it forged me. I was done being the nice girl who could be manipulated. I was moving into a phase of radical self-interest. The custody mediation was the final battlefield. Julian showed up with a high-priced lawyer, trying to paint me as unstable and vengeful for tracking his movements. But then, my attorney introduced a final piece of evidence: Julian's own email archive. We found a series of emails where he had been coaching the program coordinator on how to bypass our building's security logs. He told her to enter through the service garage and use the freight elevator to avoid Frank at the front desk. This wasn't an impulse. It was a strategy. The mediator, a seasoned woman who had seen everything, sat back in her chair. Her expression changed permanently. She looked at Julian with a mixture of disgust and cold professional assessment. The unstable narrative died right there. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a person who systematically planned to deceive everyone in his life. The mediation shifted entirely in my favor, ensuring that our son would be protected from this level of manipulation. The downfall was total and absolute. The childcare organization revoked the coordinator's license, ensuring she would never work with children in this state again. Julian's employment was terminated, and his lucrative severance package was denied. The vendor complaint was upheld, and his reputation was punctured in every professional circle that mattered. He went from a rising star to a cautionary tale in a matter of weeks. There was no shouting in the end. There were just signatures on legal documents and the quiet closing of office doors. I watched it all from a distance, feeling a strange sense of peace. I hadn't set out to destroy him. I had simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own actions. The world he had built on a foundation of lies had finally succumbed to the weight of the truth. He was left with nothing but his own company, and I suspected he would find that to be the harshest punishment of all. In the months that followed, I accepted a promotion I had delayed for years in the name of family stability. I realized I had been holding myself back to keep him comfortable. I moved into a brighter, smaller apartment closer to my son's new school. We created new routines and had new mornings filled with laughter and honest conversation. My house sounded lighter, like the windows had finally learned how to breathe without the tension of secrets. People kept asking me how I stayed so calm throughout the entire ordeal. I stopped calling it calm. I started calling it clarity. When you finally see things for exactly what they are, the emotional noise dies down. You don't have to be angry when you are busy being free. I was no longer a librarian of betrayal. I was an architect of a new, honest life. My son was happy. My career was flourishing, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I spent years thinking I was losing my marriage, a loss I feared would define me. But standing in my new living room, watching the sunset, I realized I was actually escaping a permission slip I never meant to sign. I had given Julian permission to treat me poorly by always offering forgiveness before he even asked for it. I had been a participant in my own diminishment. The day I stopped forgiving everything was the day I finally started choosing myself. Everything changed, not because he was caught, but because I decided I was worth the truth. I am Felicia Belair. I am 34 years old, and I am no longer a hobby for someone else to manage. I am the main character of a story that is just beginning, and this time the ending is entirely up to me. I walked over to my son's room, tucked him in, and felt the immense power of a life built on a foundation of absolute, unshakable honesty.